I can find the product of a whole number and a mixed number using the distributive property. We're going to be starting with lesson 38 tonight in our fraction unit and still continuing with that distributive property. To review again, guys, let's talk about factors. A factor is a number that you multiply to get a product. A product is an answer to a multiplication problem, and factors are those numbers that you multiply together to get to that product. Okay, so this problem is set up as a distributive, using the distributive property, but we have to look for the unknown factors. Well, over here we're multiplying by 4, and we're multiplying this with 4/7, just like we did in that previous lesson. But what is missing? What factor is missing in these two sets? Well, remember, I want you to think of this as 8 copies of 4 and 4/7. That's what this is basically saying. So now what's missing in there? Well, we're missing the 8. So we're going to fill in these two spots with the factor of 8. So we have 8 copies of 4 and 8 copies of 4/7. All right, fill in the unknown factors for 9 times 7 and 7/10. And they're using the distributive property. So right now we have the factors of 9 in each one of these sets. What are we missing here? Let's look at this. Remember, this right here is a factor, but this means 9 copies of 7 and 7/10. So what's missing in here is the 7, and this one is the 7/10. 9 copies of 7 and 9 copies of 7/10. Multiply, and we're going to be using the distributive property to solve 6 times 8 and 2/7. So this just means 6 copies of 8 and 6 copies of 2/7. So let's split that up. We've got 6 copies of 8 plus 6 copies of 2/7. So now we can solve. 6 times 8. Well, that's 48 plus the 12/7, because 6 times 2 is 12. Now we have to make sure that this improper fraction or this fraction is simplified, and it's simplified into a mixed number. We can't leave this like that. So we got to find how many wholes do we have in here. 7 times what gives us close to 12? Well, 7 times 2 is 14. So that's a little bit too much. So we definitely don't have 2 wholes in that. But what we do have is 1 whole. So let's bring down our 48. We're setting up that nice funnel. We've got 1 whole in there, that's 7. And how many do we have left? We have 5/7 left over. So our answer is 49 and 5/7. Look at how nice that funnel looks to get to our answer. Our next one, using the distributive property to solve 4 times 20 and 8/12. So it means we have 4 copies of 20 and 4 copies of 8/12. So let's set up our parentheses. So we've got 4 times 20, 4 copies of 20, plus 4 copies of 8/12. All right, now we can solve. 4 times 20 is 80, plus 4 times 8 is 32 over 12. All right, we cannot leave 30/12. We need to simplify this and make it into a mixed number. So we need to think about how many wholes can I pull out of this. So 12 times what gives us close to 32? Well, if I did 12 times 3, that would give me 36. So that's 32, so that's too high. So there's going to be 2 wholes that I can pull out of this, and that would give me 24. So we've got 80 plus 2 wholes, and if it's 24, that means I have 8/12 left over. Now we can continue to add. 80 plus 2 is 82 and 8/12. All right, but I know how much I annoy you with this, guys. We cannot leave 8/12 as that fraction because it needs to be simplified. If we simplify 8 and 12, what factor do they have in common? Well, they've got 4 as a common factor, which would give us 82 and 2/3. And again, what a beautiful photo. Continuing with the distributive property for 30 and 300ths times 12. Well, this problem, they just used the commutative property and switched the numbers around. So we could still use the commutative property and switch it right back. So I'm going to do 12 times 30 and 300ths. And using the distributive property, let's set the parentheses up. That means I have 12 copies of 30 plus 12 copies of 300ths. So what I need to do is multiply those parentheses. Now, if we look over here, this looks a little bit harder, and we've done math like this previously. We've done this before, where we do 12 times 30, and it has a 0. Let's take away that 10 and only focus on the 12. The 12 and the 3. Well, 12 times 3 is 36, and we multiply it with that 10 that you see here. That becomes 10 times 36. Well, that becomes 360. And now let's bring down our plus sign. And we're going to multiply 12 times 3 is 36 over 100. So now what we have is, we can add them up now, 360 and 36/100ths. Brandon is cutting 9 boards of woodworking project. Each board is 4 5/8 feet long. What is the total length of the boards? All right, so let's start looking for the important information that we see in this. And we see that he's cutting boards, 9 boards, and each board is 4 5/8 feet long. We want to know what the total is of the length of the boards. All right, so what we want to do, that we're kind of saying here, is 9 copies of 4 5/8, because he has 9 and each one of them is that long, 4 5/8. So we have 9 copies of 4 5/8. All right, so we're going to use a distributive property to help break this down. So let's set up our parentheses. So we have 9 copies of 4 plus 9 copies of 5/8. Okay, so when we multiply them now, we've got 36 on this side, and we've got 9 times 5 is 45 over 8. But, my friends, 45/8 is a fraction greater than 1. We'll call it an improper fraction. So we want to pull out those holes that are in 45/8 to make a mixed number. So 8 times what gives us close to 45? And if we do 8 times 6, that's 48. So that's too high. If we do 8 times 5, that would be close because that's a 40. So we can pull out 5 wholes, and we are left with 5/8. Now we can bring down the other side. 36 plus 5 is 41, and 5/8. And again, what a beautiful funnel. Rocky the collie ate 3 1/4 cups of dog food each day for 2 weeks. How much dog food did Rocky eat in that time? Oh, I love collies. That was my very first dog that I ever had when I was really, really little. I had a collie. Her name was Bonnie. And I also had a dog named Rocky too. So a lot of schema on Rocky and collie and collies. All right, so let's start looking at the question very carefully, and we're looking at that Rocky the collie ate 3 1/4 cups of dog each day for 2 weeks. How much did he eat in that time? How much dog food did he eat? Well, guys, we need to understand how many days are in 2 weeks. No, that's going to help us solve that problem. That's like a missing information. So how many days are in 2 weeks? Well, we've got 14 days that are in 2 weeks, because in 1 week, there's 7 days. And then you need to add another week, which would be 14 days. So now we can actually solve this problem. And we're going to be using the distributive property. So we've got 14 copies of 3 1/4 cups. Okay, because each day he had 3 1/4. All right, so let's start breaking this up by using the distributive property. So let's get our parentheses. So I have 14 copies of 3 plus 14 copies of 1/4. All right, let's start solving it. So 14 times 3 is 42, plus 14 times 1 is 14/4. All right, well, again, we can't leave this type of fraction, a fraction greater than 1, or an improper fraction. We need to simplify it and make it into a mixed number. So we need to carefully look at that and say 4 times what will give us close to 14. How many wholes can we pull out of there? Well, we can pull out 3 wholes, because 3 times 4 is 14. And that means we are left with, well, 3 times 4 is 12. 12 take away from 14 would give us 2. So we are left with 3 2/4. So now we can bring down our 42. 42 plus 3 is 45 2/4. I also see that 2/4 can be simplified. The factor that they share is a 2. So we're left with 45 1/2. And again, what a just lovely funnel. Believe in yourself and you will be unstoppable. All right, let's believe in ourselves and say that we can do the distributive property by helping solve 7 3/4 times 9. And I want to see your work tomorrow. Keep shining on, guys, and use the distributive property for 9 times 8 and 7/9. And I want to see your work tomorrow. Last one, multiply and use the distributive property for 4 times 8, 5/8. And, of course, bring your work in tomorrow. Just keep swimming. Be the best person you can be. Have a wonderful night.